Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video, and today we're talking about the Spellsword class, a hybrid between magic and melee with loads of versatility and build potential. As always in my class guide videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know about this class, how their abilities work, how and when to upgrade to the master side, which races pair well with them, what starting skill line to choose, what additional skill lines offer good synergy, and what items can enhance the build. And finally, I'll show a bit of gameplay so you could get a sense of how the class actually plays and feels at the table. I'll put timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead, although I would really appreciate if you stick around for the whole thing. Now, a quick disclaimer, I think figuring things out for yourself is one of the most rewarding parts in this game, and I would encourage everyone to experiment and find their own playstyle. That said, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at first, so this guide is here to help you get started and understand how the class works. And if you're already a seasoned player, I hope you can still find something interesting here too. And now let's get into the guide. Alright, as always, let's start with the innate ability on the Novice side, which says the following. Once per turn, you may drain one available level 1 skill die to trigger the effect of any of its instant signs as if you are performing an engage. And there is a lot to unwrap in this innate ability, so let's go kinda section by section to see how it actually works. And first of all, we may drain a die. And drain die, they usually sit outside of your adventure mat, somewhere on your race sheet or just somewhere on the side, and normally you can't access those dice anymore during the battle. It's kind of one per battle effect, if you will, but then you can recover them at the end of battle. During the end of battle cleanup, they go back to your adventurer mat. The next part is this innate abilities, as they will may drain available die, and again available meaning that all those dice, they are sitting in your attributes slots somewhere like that. Means they are not in your cooldown, they are not in your active slots, and they are not drained, so again available it means they are ready to roll and sitting in your attribute rows just like so. Next, let's figure out what this star symbol with the letter I means. And well, there are different kind of effects, different kind of ways how you can resolve the die depending again on specific dice or skill line. If we have a look at the acrobatic skill line, you can see the letter C next to all of these dice. It means these dice go to your cooldown track. Next we have illusion, and they have the S symbol, which means they go to status effects. It's either go to some specific units or hexes. It's kind of different way you can resolve the dice, which is very different from this star letter with the I symbol. Next we have light armor as an example of active dice, which normally after resolving these dice they sitting in the active slots. And next we have speech dice, which all of them are drained, and as we already covered, this kind of once per battle effects that they go off your adventure mat until you recover them. And finally we have those instant effects, and it's probably the majority of actually damage dealing effects. As you can see, there is force shock as an example. Alright, and finally let's see what as if you are performing an engage, what that part actually means. And the main thing you need to know about this part is that you can treat this as a free engage. Let's say if you already engaged an enemy this turn, normally you would need to add light fatigue according to the difficulty settings for any other additional engage this turn. However, for this particular innate ability you don't need to do that. You're gonna skip this part because it's a free engage, but other than that, that's pretty much a proper engage, which means you need to be in appropriate battle form, and depending on the dice that you want to resolve, you need to have a target. That target needs to be in range, inside, so all of this jazz normally applies, and you can even use items. So yeah, just normally again, as you would normally do for all other engages. The only difference that it's a free engage, you don't need to add light fatigue. And now let's put all of this together. Let's take this die as an example. It's a level 1 die from the Distraction Staff skill line called Force Shock, and because it's a level 1 skill die and because it's sitting in our attribute rows, which means it's available, we may drain this to trigger this effect. In order to do that, we would need to be in magic battle form, which we currently are, so that is correct. And of course we would need some magic stats, but which we don't currently have, so ignore this part for now. This is obviously just for demonstration purposes. But yeah, we can choose this die. We are in magic battle form, and normally you would need to roll the die to resolve its effect, which obviously, because the random nature of rolling the die, you never know what you get. But for this ability you can choose, for example, you can choose to deal 2 damage with this side, or you can choose to gain 2 tenacity with this side, or you can choose to gain 1 tenacity with this side, or you can choose to deal 4 damage with this side. And this what makes this innate ability so strong, because you can choose the result instead of rolling and hoping to get some result, so it's 100% control of what you get. And after you've done this, let's say 4 damage, then you deal 1 damage to adventure as part of this effect of this die, and then you drain it. So normally you can't return it back to your attribute row, throws until the end of battle. So as you can already tell, this innate ability alone makes Spellsword such a unique class already, even though we haven't even got to some of the juiciest part actually. But yeah, just this ability alone is crazy good, and it's also very powerful because you don't need to rely on the luck of the roll. You can choose the side, so you have kind of very precisely deal damage when you need to, gain tenacity when you need to, different effects of course from different dice. But yeah, this is just crazy good from this innate ability alone. Of course, if you keep using your innate ability every turn, you will pretty quickly find yourself with a bunch of dice drained sitting outside of your adventure mat, so this sometimes can be a little bit tricky situation, but luckily we have a way to recover this drained dice thanks to the next class ability. That class ability is Hero's Vigor, which says for X tenacity, recover 1 drained skill die. The tenacity cost for this ability is equal to the level of the recovered die. So for example, because this Force Shock skill die is a level 1 skill die, which means we need to spend 1 tenacity in order to recover it. And let's say if we do that, this goes back to our attribute row, ready for rolling or ready for using with our innate ability again. Keep in mind that the cost of this ability is X, which is slightly different from kind of similar effects, where you sometimes can choose different amount of tenacity in order to gain different strength of effects. For example, like Dragon Knight's Dragon Leap, or with Sorcerer's Power Surge ability, or with Acrobat ability, where it's worded like you can spend any additional amount of tenacity. But in this case, you just spend X amount of tenacity depending on the level of the die. So the cost is already built in, if you will, in this initial cost, which is pretty important for certain effects that we're gonna cover later in this video. So yeah, naturally we have a huge synergy between the innate ability and our first class ability, that we can drain dice and then we can recover them, potentially even on the same turn. Moving on to the next class ability, Meticulous Disassembly. For 1 tenacity in magic battle form, discard an item, then heal for 3 health. If you discarded a legendary item, also deal 3 damage to an adjacent enemy. So let's say we spend 1 tenacity and we are in magic battle form, we can discard an item, just like so, and we heal for 3 health. And because the item we discarded is a legendary item, we can then deal 3 damage to an adjacent enemy. Now keep in mind, if you just want to heal, you can discard any item. It doesn't have to be legendary. It's the legendary part only counts with the dealing damage, but healing comes from any item, including common item. At first I thought this ability is a bit weird because you need to be in magic battle form, but the damage you are dealing is only to adjacent enemy. But if you read the class name Spellsword, it actually kind of makes sense thematically, I guess. Now obviously dealing just 3 damage isn't that much, especially if you consider that a lot of enemies have defense 2, sometimes defense 3, so those kind of enemies that would take no damage from this ability, but nevertheless I find it pretty helpful, particularly against divert enemies, like this one, Argonian Marauder sitting with the last health chip. Yeah, if you just don't want to make another engage, but you just want to finish them off, this ability can be pretty helpful. So overall I would say this isn't my favorite ability, but I just appreciate the different utility that you can deal a little bit of damage here and there, you can heal a bit, and the fact that it costs just 1 tenacity is pretty nice as well. Moving on, next we have Soul Reservoir. For 3 tenacity, interrupt. When you are dealt damage, prevent an amount of that damage equal to the number of enemies in the defeated stack. Let's pretend that we have these 2 enemies on the clash and we defeat them, but as you may already know, instead of returning them back to the drawbag, we instead put them in a separate stack called defeated stack, next to the clash. And this defeated stack is important for certain game effects or skills like Necromancy, or in this case, Soul Reservoir. And because this skill is interrupt, which means it's a reaction to something, certain trigger, in this case is when you are dealt damage. So if this Argonian Marauder would attack us, we may choose to prevent that damage using Soul Reservoir, and the amount of damage that we can prevent is equal to the number of enemies in this defeated stack, which in this case is 2. And personally, I think this ability is fantastic. Generally, on a normal clash, you typically defeat at least 1 or 2 enemies in a single turn, sometimes even more than that, so I would say at worst this ability can prevent 2 damage, but in best case scenario, in some endgame dungeons or in a delve, this stack of defeated enemies can be huge at 6, 8 or sometimes 10 or even more enemies, and that means you can prevent that much damage. And this honestly might be the best damage preventing ability in the game. There are some similar effects from other classes, but usually there is some cost associated with that, whether you need to either drain a die and without necessarily having the ability to return them back to recover them. So yeah, but this one, you just, as long as you have enemies in the defeated stack, you can always prevent damage, and it's usually gross, so it's getting better over time. especially again in some endgame dungeons in particular. And I think it's pretty nice thematically as well. So yeah, just all in all, I love ability, the way it works mechanically and the way it works kind of thematically. Yeah, just big thumbs up for this ability. I love it. Moving on, next we have Riven Blows. For 3 tenacity in heavy or light weapon, drain an available warrior type skill die, then deal 2 true damage to a targetable enemy and heal for 2 health. And I guess the main question that most beginner players have is what this kind of sword icon means on this particular skill. And well, let's take a look at the two-handed skill line as an example. If you look at the bottom of the sheet, you see exact that icon. That means that this skill line is kind of belongs to the warrior constellation. So in order to use this ability, you need to drain available die from this warrior constellation, and you might think that you might need to have two-handed or one-handed shield or other skill lines, but the good news, I think it's a very overlooked rule, that's the actual very basic combat dice that each adventurer starts with. It also belongs to this warrior constellation. So yeah, you can trigger this ability just by draining this basic combat-wide dice, which again I think is a very overlooked rule, but yeah, that's at least how it works, and I'm glad it works this way, which means this ability is kind of more useful than at least I personally even initially thought. And as you already know from discussing the innate ability, available die means this die needs to sit in your attribute row, meaning available for rolling, and draining dice means it's going off your adventure mat, but again we have now a way of recovering those drained die using Hero's Vigor. So now we have even more synergy between the abilities within our class. We can now have more different kind of useful ways of draining the die. We can either drain it in order to trigger the certain effect of using the innate ability, or we can drain the die in order to deal 2 true damage and heal for 2 health. This ability may seem pretty similar to Meticulous Disassembly because you're also dealing damage and healing, but because this is a true damage, this is what makes it quite different. Even though it costs 3 tenacity instead of 1, I personally find it much more useful. Of course, keep in mind that you need to be either in heavy or light weapon battle form, and targetable enemy for this particular battle forms are only your adjacent enemies, but I think this is not a problem overall for our class because we're kind of generally speaking trying to stay adjacent to enemies anyway. Overall, I would say this is a fantastic ability. Even though it's quite pricey, it costs 3 tenacity, I think the effect is totally worth it. Dealing 2 true damage is very helpful against high defense enemies, where especially when you need to deal some kind of final blow, or maybe if you need to heal yourself for 2 health and you don't want to discard an item, or even if you don't have an item in the first place, I think is great. And the fact that this ability works even on a basic combat dice certainly makes it even better, at least certainly better than I initially thought until I learned that basic combat skill dice belong to the warrior type constellation as well. So overall, just another awesome ability, and I love it. And at last but not least, we have Strategic Reserve. For 5 tenacity in magic battle form, refresh any one adventurer's race ability. So race abilities are once per battle effects that are printed on the race sheets just like this one, and they are obviously very powerful. This is why they are balanced in such a way that you can use them on the once per battle, but with this ability you can refresh it, which means that that adventurer will be able to use their racial ability again. And in case Spellsword's innate ability as well as pretty much all other class abilities weren't strong enough for you, yeah, now we have this. I think it goes without saying how powerful racial abilities are, so this Strategic Reserve is kind of amplifies this even further. Remember that you can use your class abilities once per turn, so as long as you have tenacity you can potentially trigger this ability even every turn, effectively using your race ability every turn as well, which is just huge. And it even works not only on your adventure but on anyone adventure, so if you're playing in party you can refresh their race ability. Yeah, it's just huge. Keep in mind that you need to be in magic battle form, and you can probably tell that's kind of the general theme of this class of using physical weapons as well as some magic battle forms. Yeah, that's kind of, I think it's in the name, frankly, Spellsword. Yeah, I think it makes sense thematically, and the fact that it costs 5 tenacity is a lot, but frankly there are ways of kind of mitigate this slightly that we're gonna talk about later in this video. Now let's talk about how to become a Master Spellsword, which says that you need to have a total of 8 skill dice trained across the combat skill line and any magic type skill lines. So combat skill line is pretty simple, is your basic combat wide dice, and magic skill line is any skill line that has this symbol at the bottom, like this distraction staff skill line for example. So with this particular 4 skill dice, that means we're kind of halfway through, we already have 4 out of 8, and we need to train just 4 more skill dice, either from any of these skill lines in order to become master. Now keep in mind that if you train skills from the same skill line, that would get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So let's say if we have this 2 skill lines currently already trained, and let's say if we train just 1, 2, 3, 4 of the same skill line, that means that would be enough to become a master, because that would be 8 in total, but the price would be 10 extra experience that we need to spend in order to advance this from left to right. So if you want to slightly reduce the experience cost and become a master spell sword just a little bit quicker, just maybe think about some other skill lines that you can train and advance and train those skill dice from those new skill lines, because just generally speaking just cheaper than training a skill line of, let's say, level 3 or level 4 from your existing skill lines. So yeah, other than that, there is not much to say about this upgrade requirements. It's definitely not the hardest among other classes. It's definitely doable, and as soon as you train 4 of total skill dice trained across your combat and magic skill lines, then you're good. So now let's see what's changed on the master side, as always starting with the innate ability. Once per turn, you may drain 1 level 1 skill die from anywhere on your adventure map to trigger the effect of any of its instant sides, as if you are performing an engage. So the overall mechanic stays the same, with the only difference that now we can drain die from anywhere on our adventure map. And the word anywhere on the adventure map basically includes 3 locations. First of all, it's our attribute rows, just what we would normally call the available skill dice. Then we have active slots sitting on top of our adventure mat, and then we have the cooldown track sitting at the bottom of the adventure mat. And while this change on the innate ability on the master side may seem very subtle or even not like a big deal, trust me, this is huge. Essentially, you can now roll any dice first, just roll and resolve them as normal. This would go to your cooldown track, and now you can trigger this die again using your innate ability. So yeah, this is just absolutely huge power boost, because you can essentially trigger any dice several times in a turn, which is just a massive power boost. Moving on to the next class ability on the master side, Hero's Vigor stays exactly the same. Nothing changed here, and I'm glad it didn't, because it's already a massive synergy with the innate ability. Yeah, you can recover any die of any level, which is huge. Now moving on, next we have Meticulous Disassembly. This doesn't change much. The only difference is that now we can discard any items, which means doesn't have to be legendary. Any common items would do, and you would gain the full power of this effect, which means you are healing and dealing damage even for a common item. So yeah, pretty welcome change, but not maybe as a big deal as for the innate ability. Moving on to the next class ability, Soul Reservoir. This doesn't change at all mechanically, and the only change that it costs 2 tenacity now instead of 3, which frankly is quite a big deal, because as I already mentioned, Spellsword is a very power hungry class. So yeah, the less tenacity it costs, the better. This obviously is a huge saver for some especially endgame dungeons, or maybe in delves when you have a huge stack of defeated enemies. So yeah, using this ability more frequently is very nicely. So yeah, I love it. I love the change that it costs now to tenacity. And finally, we have a brand new ability that was not available on the Novice side at all. It is called Eldritch Insight. For 3 tenacity enduring, you may use your innate ability on a skill die of any level. And so obviously using your innate ability on the level 1 skill dice is pretty cute and all, but now just think about it that you can use it on level 2 skill dice, or level 3, or even level 4, which is just mind-blowing, huge upgrade. And what's even better is that this ability is enduring, which means you don't even need to spend tenacity. As long as you are sitting at 3 or more, this effect always applies. It's kind of another passive effect, so it's just awesome. Think about some particularly strong level 3 or level 4 dice, like this one Executioner, for example, from 2-handed skill line. And normally it's pretty hard to get this result, because this die has 3 sides of misses. So yeah, again, not very reliable, but thanks to this Eldritch Insight in combination with your innate ability, you can just instantly resolve this effect, guarantee 100%. Yeah, super strong. I think this ability alone opens up so many possibilities for Spellsword. Just think about all skill lines of level 2, 3 and 4, not only from the current skill lines, but maybe even potentially from the future skill lines that will be added to the game later on, and Spellsword will be able to use them all. I think honestly this is ridiculously strong, kind of borderline overpowered a bit, but tons of fun nevertheless. Yeah, I just love it. Moving on to the next class ability, Riven Blows, and it stays exactly the same, and frankly I think that's fair enough. Asking for more damage or reducing the cost of this ability I think would be a bit too much, so yeah, I think it's fine as it is, perfectly usable. So yeah, is fine ability. And finally, on the master side, we have the upgraded version of Strategic Reserve, which stays exactly the same mechanically, with the only difference that it now costs 4 tenacity instead of 5. And well, what can I say? One of the strongest ability in the entire game now costs 1 less tenacity. Well, yeah, I think this is just crazy powerful. Now let's select a race for our Spellsword, and the first option I would consider is Breton. I think Bretons have a nearly perfect stats for Spellsword, just a nice amount of health as well as kind of slight focus on the magicka, which is probably what we're gonna need anyway. But of course, and most importantly, Breton have a quite strong racial ability that allow to use overtax effects on weapons or armor. But of course, remember, because we have Strategic Reserve, we can refresh our racial ability and use this multiple times in a battle, so you can potentially have one overtax effect on a one weapon. You can use your racial ability to, instead of discarding an item, you move this item to your pack and bring in another item to your ready slot, then you refresh your racial ability and use this again, and you can go on back and forth between these particular weapons or armor depending on the overtaxing effects. And there are a couple of items that are very synergistic with this build, so I think Breton racial ability is pretty strong specifically for Spellsword, and of course because you can use this ability multiple times, you can trigger this effect, kind of effectively overtaxing a weapon or an armor and moving this item to your pack, and then bringing another item to your ready slot. Then you can refresh your racial ability using a Strategic Reserve, then overtaxing another weapon, then bringing back that weapon that you initially overtaxed and kind of move to your pack. So you can potentially go on in circle, moving items between your pack and ready slot and using the same overtax effect multiple times in a battle, which is just huge. As an obvious downside, you need to have those items in the first place in order to overtax them and in order to get the synergy with Strategic Reserve. So yeah, this is kind of a little bit awkward in the start because you're likely not gonna have some strongest items just yet, but this might get really strong towards the end game. The next option to consider is Orc. Personally, I think Orc's racial ability is probably one of the strongest in the game. Once per battle, after the end of your turn, gain 1 over fatigue to take an immediate extra turn, which is already very strong on its own, but how about using this ability every turn instead of just once per battle? And because you can use your class abilities once per turn, so you can use your Strategic Reserve to refresh your race ability, but then you give yourself an extra turn, and that is already kind of counted as towards a new turn, so you can use your Strategic Reserve again, effectively just giving your extra turns an extra turn after another one. Yeah, this just can get absolutely nuts. There are even ways to make it kind of almost infinite, so yeah, if you want some absolutely crazy shenanigan you can do, I think Orc is probably the way to go for you. The next race option to consider is Dark Elf. I think their racial ability is one of the strongest in the game as well, kind of similar to Orc. You recover an extra dice, which effectively gives you extra turn. It's not as crazy as for Orcs, but at the same time you're not gaining over fatigue, so it's slightly less punishing, specifically if you're playing on the expert difficulty. But yeah, I think it's still super crazy strong as well. I think starting with 3 magicka and 2 combat dice in particular is pretty helpful, especially in the early game. So yeah, I think this is pretty nice. Independent how do you want to build your character, or maybe how do you think about it kind of thematically, I think Dark Elves is a pretty nice option too. And the final race option to consider for the purpose of this video is Imperial. I think the starting stats are pretty balanced in a way that you can advance your character either more in physical or magic forms, depending how do you want to level it up. But of course, most importantly, the racial ability once per battle, when you would be dealt 3 or fewer damage, prevent the damage and instead gain that match tenacity. Now again, remember that we have Strategic Reserve, that only for 4 tenacity we can refresh our racial ability. And so with this ability you can gain essentially up to 3 tenacity for free, which is almost already enough to trigger your Strategic Reserve to make this ability available again. And I genuinely tried all of those race options specifically to pair them with Spellsword in different play accounts, and yes, in case you wonder, I do play a lot of this game, especially before making the class guide videos. I want to make sure that I know the class inside out, and I tried it in different kind of race combinations or in different builds in different play accounts. So yeah, so in all of my playthroughs I enjoyed playing Spellsword as Imperial the most. And while Imperial racial ability might be the weakest among these options, especially if you keep in mind Strategic Reserve, that you can refresh your racial ability and use it over and over again throughout the combat, I think it's actually the most reliable, since the fact you can gain this tenacity essentially for free, you can prevent some extra damage, which is very welcome, especially when you're playing in true solo. So as I always say, you can pair any race with any class and it will be just fine, but for the purpose of this guide I'll stick to Imperial. Alright, we've got our race, we've got our class, now it's time to build up our character. And the way it works is pretty simple. There are round slots on the left and right sides of the adventure map where you slot in the attributes, the tokens, as well as the skill lines tokens. And then you advance your skill lines or stats either from left to right or from right to left, and those stats and skills, they meet in the middle, which opens up a lot of interesting decisions to make while building up your character. As I always say, it's best to have at least a general picture how do you want to level up and advance your character, because you can't swap the position of those circle stat tokens or skill line tokens in the middle of the game. And I must say right away that Spellsword is a pretty tricky class to level up and advance, because generally speaking you either want to kind of focus on the physical weapon, and hence why you would need more stamina, more other skill lines, or they want to lean heavily on magicka, which means you would need some more magic stats and more magic skill lines. But in case of Spellsword you would need both, which on the one hand I think it definitely limits the way how you can level up the character, but on the other hand I think this is what makes it so interesting. So for the first attribute, stat token health, I'm just gonna slot in on the top left slot. For no particular reason, I just like to have health on that particular position. Next we have stamina, and this is where the real question comes into play. Do we want to put this across health, or do we want to put this on a separate row? Well, I think I definitely want to level up my health just slightly, but I also need to have my stamina at least up to 3 or maybe 4, so probably not gonna put this across health. I think I'm just gonna put this somewhere here along with 2 corresponding stat tokens. Next we have magicka, and again similar question, similar thought process. Do I want to put this across health, or do I want to put this across stamina, or do I want to put this on a standalone row? And while we're definitely gonna need some magicka for this particular character, probably actually not as much as stamina. So I think, you know what, I'm probably gonna be alright just putting my stamina across health, maybe something like that. And finally, for the combat skill line, I think I'm just gonna slot this across stamina. This might be not ideal, but frankly I just want to level up and train 4 other skill lines, so that was the only choice where I could slot in my combat skill line. And last but not least, let's switch our cooldown value to the starting position of 2, and we're good to go. Now for the starting skill line, as you might already guessed, I'm gonna slot in the distraction stuff. Not only because it's a nice signature with the innate ability, because these dice are pretty strong, but we can choose the side that we want to resolve, but also because I want to level up my Spellsword to master, to promote it to master, and one of the requirements is to level up to train this magicka type skill dice. Alright, and so that is how my starting character would look like. So the Destruction Staff skill line comes with a 2 level 1 dice called Force Shock, and we already kind of briefly touched about this, but they basically deal either 2 damage on one side, or deal 4 damage on the other side and 1 true damage to any adventurer, or you can gain 2 tenacity and deal 1 true damage to any one adventurer. So generally speaking, these dice are pretty strong, but kind of pretty chaotic, because you never know if you're gonna need to take some true damage or not, but thanks to our innate ability we can just precisely know when we need to get some effects. Maybe sometimes all you need is just 2 damage, so you don't even need to roll and hoping to avoid the extra taking true damage. This way you just know precisely that you're gonna deal 2 damage and that's it. Or maybe in some other cases you know that you want to deal the maximum amount of damage, so we just draining it with the result of 4 damage, and thankfully we even have 2 ways that we can heal ourselves from this damage taken. So overall I would say there is a great synergy between Spellsword and this dice in particular. Moving on to the level 2, we have 2 options between Wall of Elements and Destructive Touch. Now as you can tell, all sides of the Wall of Elements dice, they are drained, and remember that we want to have as much instant effects to trigger with our innate ability, so I think Wall of Elements is just out of the way, so let's focus on Destructive Touch instead. Destructive Touch is definitely one of the trickiest dice in the game. On one side you can just instantly defeat a level 1 enemy. On another side, you can choose a level 1 or 5 enemy and deal true damage equal to that enemy's current health to adventurers divided among them as you choose, then defeat that enemy. And on the last side, you can instantly defeat a level 1 or 5 enemy and then apply Bane status die to any one adventurer. So as you can tell by the number of these little dots next to the face icon, the middle result is kind of the most statistically common result. It's a 50% chance of gaining this particular result, where you would need to take true damage equal to the enemy's current health, which is a lot, especially if you're playing in true solo. So let's say if you rolled this result and you want to defeat an enemy with 5 health, it means you would need to take 5 true damage, which makes it just completely not viable in playing solo. But yeah, thankfully to our innate ability, we can just completely ignore this particular result and just get, the best results we can get just defeating a level 1 enemy without any downsides, or we can instantly defeat a level 1 or 5 enemy for just Bane instead of taking that much damage, which is obviously much better. And there are also a couple of more things you need to know about this particular dice. First of all, if you read carefully, it just says defeat an enemy, and that's it. There is no mention of target, and hence why this enemy that you are defeating doesn't need to be in range or even in sight. And that means that you can defeat any enemy currently in the game, even if it's just 10 tiles away in a very long delve, or even if it's on a different floor in a dungeon, just any enemy in the game. Also, because these dice, they don't deal any damage strictly speaking, and it just says defeat, this effect kind of completely bypasses certain enemy skills, for example like elusive or stalwart. So I would say that Destructive Touch is very powerful. It's very tricky to use on most other classes, frankly on all other classes, but except Spellsword in particular, simply because we can choose the side of this die rather than relying on a roll. And even though it only works on level 1 or 5 enemies, I would say don't underestimate them, especially if you're playing in true solo. Even small, they sometimes hit pretty hard, and certain especially level 5 enemies, they roll 3 combat dice, which can just instantly teleport you to the nearest town and just completely finish off your campaign if you're not careful with them, or especially if you get swarmed with delves, where just the majority of monsters of enemies, they are level 1 or 5. So yeah, this is a huge help even in the late game. So on level 2 we definitely slotting in Destructive Touch. Moving on to the level 3, we have 3 options of Pulsar, Elemental Drain and Elemental Rage. Now, as you can tell, Elemental Drain is a status die, and remember that we're looking for instant effects that we can trigger with our innate ability, so I would say Elemental Drain, even though it's an awesome die, it's just probably out of question for this particular character. I would say that both Pulsar and Elemental Rage are very powerful dice. In certain circumstances, maybe one is better than the other, but generally speaking, at this point of the game, I would still want to loot some caches. I don't want to blow them up. So yeah, it's very early in the game, it's just 4th experience, so probably for this particular reason, I would probably slot in Pulsar first. But no worries, we still might come back to Elemental Rage just a bit later, but for now let's focus on Pulsar. And what Pulsar essentially does, it deals 2 true damage, blinds your target and then blinds yourself as well. Now generally speaking, blindness can be quite problematic for certain ranged classes, for certain characters, but I would say because we're kind of hybrid between the melee character and the ranged character, and we generally speaking want to kind of stay pretty close to enemies, I would say this is not a problem for us. And for the exact same reason, I would say that blinding enemies isn't much of a help for us in particular, because we generally speaking want to be kind of close or even sometimes adjacent to enemies, and they will very likely, even blinded, will still target and hit us rather than other enemies. So frankly, the only reason why I prefer Pulsar is that because it deals 2 true damage to the target and 1 true damage to all adjacent unit to that target. And I think this is just awesome, and it's very helpful at any stage of the game, even if you just started now. Let's say this is just your 4th experience that you trained, or even if you are in the very end game, this die is just awesome, stays relevant. Yeah, true damage is just great. Now I think at this point we have a pretty interesting choice. We can either get back to Elemental Rage or even a level 4 skill dice, but remember that our goal at this point is to train to promote to the master side as quick as possible. And to do that we need to have a collective total of 8 dice trained across combat and magic type skill dice. But if we're going to continue training, this skill line is get pretty expensive. As you can probably tell, it now costs 3 and then another 3 for 2 last slots, so yeah, this is pretty expensive. So personally, I think that at this stage it's best to start training another skill line, and that is Daedric Summoning, which I'm gonna slot in over here. For the level 1 dice of Daedric Summoning skill line, we have the options of Daedric Curse and Bound Armaments, which I think both are really solid and great choices, but I personally prefer Daedric Curse. It can deal up to 2 true damage to an adjacent enemy, so there is already a great synergy with Pulsar, because that means that we can now deal up to 4 true damage to an adjacent enemy if we combine this together. And another side of this die allows us to trigger one of the class abilities that costs 2 or less tenacity for free. And remember when I mentioned that the X cost of the hero's vigor is pretty important, because unlike of some other kind of flexible class abilities like Sorcerer's Power Surge, where you would spend 1 tenacity first in order to kind of activate this ability, and then you would spend any amount of additional tenacity to gain different kind of strength of effect, for this hero's vigor the cost is kind of built in, it come already included in the class ability itself. So what does that mean on practice? Well, let's have a look. Let's say we used our innate ability on Destructive Touch to drain this die and trigger its effect. So this die is now drained. And because it's a level 2 die, that means that the cost of recovering this die using a hero's vigor ability is also 2. and therefore we can now use this Daedric Curse if we're lucky, if we roll this result, or if we use this with our innate ability on the next turn. We can use this result in order to kind of return back to recover this die using Hero's Vigor, because it can now costs 2 tenacity because it's a level 2 die, so we're recovering this die using this one. I think it's just a nice little way of saving some extra tenacity and essentially recovering up to 2 level die for free using your Hero's Vigor, which of course you could trigger it anyway for spending tenacity, but why would you do that if you can do this for free? And of course, plus it deals 2 damage, so this is why I like Daedric Curse so much. And now we already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 skill dice trained across combat and magic type skill dice, so we just need 1 more in order to become Master Spellsword. And for this purpose I would probably train something else from Daedric Summoning, either Bound Armaments or something from level 2, which are Power Stone or Expert Summoner. I think Expert Summoner is just something not for our build, so we can eliminate that option. So the other options are either Bound Armaments on level 1 or Power Stone on level 2. I think there is some nice synergy going on there between Bound Armaments and Spellsword, and you can tell just by looking at the required battle forms. I think it's one of the rare cases where we are a magic user, so we can roll and resolve this die using our magicka, but then we can apply this to ourselves because we're also gonna use some other battle forms, like physical battle forms like heavy weapon or light weapon. Overall, I would say that Bound Armaments is a great choice if you want your character to deal slightly more damage, because essentially you either roll in 3 enemy combat dice for free, or you can roll 2 of your available dice and then you recover them back. So yeah, both options are pretty nice, but personally I like Power Stone even more than that. Because with Power Stone you can change the result of up to 2 other dice rolled with this engage to the side of your choice, which frankly not quite needed strictly speaking, because we already have our innate ability that we can trigger any instant effect of other dice without even rolling this. So yeah, this is not like strictly needed, but it's just a nice addition of having even more control of your rolls of your dice. And even with the example that I provided earlier, that let's say if you drain your destructive touch using your innate ability, then you would normally need either tenacity to recover this for the same turn, or you would need to get pretty lucky to get a Daedric Curse with this particular side to recover it for free. But with Power Stone combined, you can essentially just have even more control of choosing the side that you want to make sure you have this result in order to recover this dice. Yeah, I think it just helps to make this engine like slightly more smoother. Yeah, and just personally that's what I prefer. And now look at that, now we have 8 dice collectively trained across combat and magic type skill dice, which means we are now Master Spellsword. I think starting at this point you can already start investing some experience in your stamina, or in your magicka, or even in your cooldown. And at this point there should be already 15 experience on the XP tracker, and that's very likely be the end of the session 1 for you, something like that. Now keep in mind that our Spellsword doesn't have much sword part yet, we just the spell part, we're just a normal spellcaster, basically like kind of close range spellcaster. But yeah, we'll get to the sword part now as well. So now for the sword part, I think we have the options of either training one-handed and shield or two-handed, but personally I prefer two-handed. So this is something that I'm gonna slot in over here, along with this just level 1 die Wrecking Blow, because there is just simply no other choices. And I know that it might feel a little bit weird seeing both of these skill lines combined on a single character, but bear with me, we'll get to this in the gameplay demo section of this video. For the level 2 of two-handed, again not much options, just a single onslaught die. I'm gonna slot in over here, and keep in mind that because it's a level 2 die, and if you look at this, one of the side is drained, so deal 5 damage to your target and then drain this die, and our Daedric Curse can recover that as well, because it costs 2, and because of the X cost of the Hero's Vigor kind of built in here, that means that the cost of recovery this die is 2, so again, just extra synergy going on there between this die, so that means we can recover not only the destructive touch, but also now this onslaught as well. Now if we get back for a moment to the level 1 die Wrecking Blow, it deals 2 damage on one side and it deals 3 damage on the other side for the cost of gaining either 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue. And I think this die is pretty okay if you're playing heavily on two-handed skill line, but that's not quite the case here. I mean, we can do 4 damage whenever we want with our Force Shock skill die, so why would we care about dealing just 3 damage for the price of 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue? That's kind of meh for our class, so I would probably untrain this skill line entirely, this skill die, so instead moving this onslaught on the very first slot. And now for the next skill which I'm gonna train is Executioner. And in case you wonder, yes, you can untrain low-level skill dice while still continue training the further higher skill dice as long as you have the previous level trained, which means in this case it's a level 2 trained, means I can train level 3 dice. This is legit. And so with Executioner we now can gain 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue to immediately defeat an adjacent not quest enemy that has less health than you do. And remember that I mentioned that normally Executioner is pretty tricky to roll because it has only 50% chance of landing this hit, but because we have our innate ability combined with Eldritch Insight, we can just choose this side whenever we want, which is just crazy. So not only we can now instantly defeat a level 1 or 5 enemy using Destructive Touch, now we can defeat any enemy instantaneously as long as it has less health than we do, even if it's a high level enemy like 10 or 20 using Executioner. So I think starting at this point I would start to invest heavily in health, probably even all the way up to 8, which is the maximum we can train on this character given that we have 3 Magicka sitting across. And even though obviously this limits the number of dice that we can roll in a single engage with Magicka, so that means we can only roll up to 3 magic dice, whether it's from destruction stuff or Daedric Summoning combined. But remember that because we have our innate ability that is essentially a free engage, we're very likely gonna more frequently just use, single die here and there, just draining this die, then maybe draining this die, then use these 2 dice together to recover this one, and that's kind of going back and forth between several dice. So I would say that whenever I play this Spellsword, it was very rarely that I would even want to roll even 3 dice, frankly. So yeah, I think 3 Magicka is enough for our character specifically, especially that given that we are kind of hybrid between the ranged character and the melee character. Having 8 health on the other hand is a tremendous boost not only to our survivability, but even more importantly so to the Executioner, and the jump between 5 and 8 health is huge. It's essentially the majority of level 10 enemies or even most of the level 20 enemies. So as long as you're sitting at your maximum health, which is 8 in this case, you are able to execute the majority of enemies in this game with just instantaneously using your innate ability. I think at this stage we definitely want to level up some cooldown, especially since with Executioner we're now gonna start gaining some fatigue or potentially even over fatigue in our cooldown track. So to recover those quickly, I think up to 4 at least at this stage should be enough. And now while we can continue training either more skill dice from the two-handed skill line, or we can return back to the Elemental Rage from Destruction Staff skill line, I think there is something better that we can do. And that something better is training Acrobatics in this slot over here alongside its level 1 skill die Phantom Fleet, which frankly we don't even care about because the only thing we take in this skill line is to train this level 2 skill dive Windwalker, and then we can even untrain this Fleet Phantom and kind of switch this and move this aside like so. And that's kind of the whole point we train in Acrobatics. So what Windwalker does is while this die in your cooldown track, your non-enduring class abilities cost X fewer tenacity for a minimum of 1. So remember that all the skill lines from the Thief Constellation, which is Acrobatics in this case, they don't require any particular battle form, which means you can combine and roll in these dice alongside your magic skill dice, for example. And I know this might be a bit confusing, so bear with me, because this basically what allows us to do is to roll this Power Stone together with Windwalker and can essentially almost guarantee get this number 2 result, making sure we have this nice juicy number 2 sitting in our cooldown track. And now while we have this die, all our class abilities they cost 2 less tenacity, which means we can use Strategic Reserve to refresh our racial ability for just 2 tenacity, or we can use a Riven Blows for just 1 tenacity, or we can prevent all damage, depending on the number of defeated enemies in the stack, for just 1 tenacity. Or we can use Hero's Vigor for just recovering dice with just a huge discount basically. And this is just huge, I love it. And I don't want to pat myself on the shoulder, but frankly I would say this is a pretty clever way of fitting this die in this build, because as I already mentioned, I played a bunch of Spellsword, different builds and races and combinations, but every time I played it, I was always short of tenacity. I always wanted to use more tenacity, but with this Acrobatics, with this Windwalker die, we can just use it much more freely, and recovering our racial ability much more frequently, or recovering some dice more frequently, it's just more goodness. Now for the next advancements, I would probably train some extra stamina first, and then a level 4 die from the two-handed skill line called Cleave in that order. And what Cleave does is basically it deals X damage either based on your current health, either on your stamina, and it also deals half of that damage rounded up to the adjacent enemies. So in this case, we would deal either 8 damage to the main target and 4 damage to the adjacent enemies, or we can deal 4 damage to the main target and 2 damage to the adjacent enemies. Although I must say that oftentimes you don't even need to choose, because again, thanks to our innate ability, we can just always choose to use this particular side that deals 8 damage based on our health instead of stamina. So yeah, they're just getting even better at this point. And I think now finally at this point we can return back to the Distraction Staff skill line and finally train Elemental Rage. And not something we actually need probably at this point, because we already have so much damage, but maybe there is sometimes just lots of little enemies around, or maybe, you know, you don't mind kind of to spread the damage across some smaller enemies, you want to finish off some divert enemies. Yeah, this is pretty nice as well. And of course, normally it deals either 5 or 7 damage, with of course 7 being the only 60% chance, because only one of the 6 faces of the die, but because we are playing Spellsword, we can always choose and resolve this particular side no matter what. So yeah, just the maximizing the damage, he just overpowers already. And for the final slot of our adventure mat, I would get back to the two-handed skill line and either train a skill level 4, a Balanced Blade, or get back to level 3 of Momentum. I think Balanced Blade is pretty helpful to help you clear your cooldown track from gaining over fatigue that you would gain from using Executioner, and trust me, you would love to use Executioner as much as you can, so you would gain a bunch of fatigue from that. Momentum, on the other hand, can deal a bunch of damage, and again, because we can choose the side that we want, we can kind of guarantee deal a bunch of damage, of course provided that we have some fatigue in our cooldown track. But again, because we're gonna use Executioner so often, we will have no shortage of fatigue in our cooldown track, so we can definitely deal some crazy damage with Momentum, and so probably for this reason I'm gonna slot in over here. Although I must say that I'm still not quite entirely sure which one is better, Momentum or Balanced Blade. I think you can totally play with both. I mean, you can choose either this or another one, but personally for this build I would probably stick with Momentum. And as the final touch, I think upgrading to the 5 cooldown is pretty nice as well. There is not much else needed, and I would probably even keep this combat dice here as well, just solely for the purpose of draining them with Raven Blows, because otherwise you would need to drain some dice from your two-handed skill line, but it's more costly to recover those, so I would rather keep those combat skill dice solely for using Raven Blows. Now let's talk about some items synergistic with this build, starting with U Inferno Staff, which says drain 1 available combat skill die to ignore your target's defense start for this engage. I think this effect is pretty strong on its own, but what's even better is the overtax effect. After this engage, recover all drained skill dice. And this is where a lot of synergy with the Breton-specific racial ability comes into play. And of course, even though we can recover drained die ourselves using Hero's Vigor, it costs tenacity and quite a lot, especially if you drain high-level die, level 3 or 4 skill dice. It would cost that much tenacity to recover them. But with this stuff, and specifically with its overtax effect, you can drain a bunch of dice first and then recover them all at once, essentially for free, even without spending tenacity. I absolutely love this item for its basic effect, I love this item for its overtax effect, and it gets even stronger when you're playing with Breton, of course. So yeah, great choice. Next we have Restoration Staff. If this engage defeats an enemy, heal for 2 health. And for the overtaxed effect, we can deal your target damage equal to your current health. And I think this is another example of a very synergistic item, specifically with the Breton racial ability. Because with the overtax effect specifically, you can deal a bunch of damage, sometimes 7 or even 8 damage. Yeah, just crazy good, essentially for free. 8 damage is a lot. It's obviously not a true damage, but there's still a lot. And this gets even better if you have 2 of those items combined. You can keep one in your pack and one in your ready slot, and you can then use a strategic reserve to refresh your ability and kind of cycle those items through using your Breton's ability. Yeah, I think this is why, with this particular 2 items, this is what makes Breton so special with the Spellsword. But even if you're playing on any other race, I think this item is still very welcome, particularly with its basic effect. If this engage defeats an enemy, heal for 2 health. And even though we have class abilities to heal ourselves, 2 in fact, Meticulous Disassembly and Reviewing Blows, I think this is still pretty nice because it's essentially a free heal. Moving on to the next item is Void Steel Axe. Just plain and simple, ignore 1 defense on your target. And I would say this particular item is more like a nice to have category rather than a must. For example, if you compare this with these 2 stuff, which are just awesome, if you found these items, try to save them, keep them away from all your shatter enemies and things like that. But for this, Void Steel Axe is kind of like, yeah, little nice to have, little help, specifically with your 2-handed skill line. Next item we have is an enchantment, and this might be the first time I'm recommending an enchantment. It's a glyph of disease resistance, and it essentially makes you immune to Bane, Fear and Maim status dice. And remember, because we're gonna use Destructive Touch a lot, which means we're gonna have Bane a lot in our cooldown track, and without a way of kinda naturally removing this with using some class abilities, I think this item is pretty nice in particular. I think this glyph is quite helpful, especially once you promote it to the master side, and once you're able to use your innate ability on Destructive Touch in particular, because that's the main source of Bane for your class. But if you found this item earlier, maybe try to save it maybe for session 2 or even session 3, just keep it safely in your pack. Because remember that once you played an enchantment, it stays in play until the end of session in this particular case, and it's not gonna carry over to the future sessions. So yeah, if you found this item early, definitely grab it and maybe save it for some endgame or session 2. The next item I would recommend for this class is House Hex's Cuirass. After an enemy engages you, gain 1 tenacity. Frankly, I would say that not every class needs this item, but for some tenacity-hungry classes like Spellsword in particular, I think this is like pretty much a must. It's an awesome item that allows you to use your class abilities more frequently, and because our class abilities are just so awesome, it means just more awesomeness, more goodness for your class. Next we have Worm Cult Sabatons. It's a legendary feat which says prevent 1 damage or recover 1 magic type skill die. And again, it's pretty hard not to recommend this item for Spellsword or for pretty much any other magic type user for that matter, so yeah, just an awesome item. Both of these armor pieces are legendary items, which sometimes harder to acquire, but as soon as you see those items in the shop or anywhere really, just try to browse them, they are awesome. The next item is Barkskin Helmet. After an enemy engages you, recover the leftmost die in your cooldown track. I think this is an amazing helmet, especially for all melee characters that get engaged more frequently, just naturally being surrounded by enemies. And because we don't have skill dice like heavy armor that we actually want to sit in our cooldown track, we don't mind recovering more dice more frequently, more magic skill dice or more two-handed skill dice, yeah, just more engages. It's just nice. And I'm genuinely surprised that this item is just a common item and not a legendary item, just because this effect is so powerful. And lastly we have Node Meat, just a consumable item. Discard this item, then gain tenacity up to your stamina stat. Obviously, as all consumable items, you need to discard this item in order to gain this effect, which means it's probably not as impactful as, let's say, some of these weapons or some of these armors. It's not like a big deal that can help throughout the whole campaign, but nevertheless, it can be quite helpful, especially to keep your Eldritch Insight active. And finally, let's see how this class plays and feels in action. For this purpose, I created this demo Clash Battle. Keep in mind that I untrained momentum, as we trained it earlier. I think this way is slightly more realistic the amount of experience needed in order to advance the character at this stage. The experience is 39, and it also means that our enemy pool is 39 because we're playing solo, and as you probably know, when an enemy pool ends on 9, that means that's the maximum number of enemies in play, so yeah, this is definitely going to be quite challenging for us. So for the enemy pool of 39, we have level 20 enemy, Frost Atronach, very high range, high defense and 3 combat dice, and also Chillbane, and because I don't have any weapon, it means after every engage I would need to gain 1 light fatigue because I'm playing with solo character. Next we have level 10, Imperial Enforcer, Rally and Divert, really bad. Generally speaking, I would try to keep all rally enemies until the end of battle. This way, this effect not gonna trigger, but because it's a ranged enemy, I think this is not gonna work. I'm probably gonna need to focus this pretty early on. Next we have level 5, Wood Elf Marauder. And yeah, just looking at this one, this is exactly the reason why I said don't underestimate level 1 or 5 enemies. Look at that, 3 combat dice, this is huge. This one hits as hard as a level 20 enemy. It also has dodge and Vine Snare meaning I'm gonna drain available combat skill dice after each engage. Yeah, this is a pretty scary looking one, and we have 4 level 1 enemies. 1 beast, again 2 combat dice. Then we have this Dark Elf Bandit, and again 2 combat dice and also Divert. Oh man, this is gonna be hard. And another level 1 Orc Bandit, and also 2 dice and also aggressive, which means it's gonna reroll all misses, or at least once. And finally we have Argonian Bandit with 1 combat dice but with the range and enfeeble 1, which means I'm gonna have more light fatigue. Keep in mind that I'm having a complete fresh start, which means I don't have any tenacity, which is very crucial for our character. This is why I said that sometimes it's very nice to have certain items, some consumables that you can use before the battle to gain some tenacity. There are quite a few of them in the game, but I don't don't have any items, no weapons, no armor, no consumables, no tenacity, which it definitely makes it quite challenging here. Alright, so it's the beginning of combat round 1, it's adventurous turn, my turn. I'm gonna start in magic battle form, and I think there are a couple of ways how we can handle this battle. I think first of all we can go pretty defensive. I could probably stay on this entrance tile, maybe even move 1 hex away. If I do that, I will likely avoid getting hit by this Wood Elf Marauder, probably from this beast, even from Argonian Bandit, and probably from this Orc Bandit as well. So yeah, definitely gonna avoid a lot of hits if I move 1 just hex behind over here. On the other hand, I don't want to have myself trapped on this pretty narrow side, because we have quite a few ranged enemies as well. We still have this Frost Atronach level 20 with range 6, and this Imperial Enforcer also have range 3, so yeah, as another way that we can handle the fight, I think this is a pretty good looking hex to do some area damage with Cleave. But because I don't have any tenacity, I think this is a bit scary to go there. Alright, I think as my first action I'm gonna roll just 2 basic Force Shock dice targeting this Orc Bandit. Because I think, first of all, if I get some tenacity, that would be great. It means I can start playing a little bit more aggressive. But if I get the damage dealing result, I can just get rid of this Orc Bandit anyway. So yeah, I think regardless of what we get, either tenacity or damage, I'll be pretty fine with this. I could also roll Destructive Touch just to see if I get some lucky roll. But you know what? I think I want to be pretty mindful about what dice I want to roll. Because keep in mind that I have a cooldown of 5, which means I'm gonna recover first these 2 dice. Then I'm gonna probably have another engage, which means I'm gonna take 2 light fatigue because I'm playing on expert difficulty, and so if I roll this die it means I can only recover those 3, but if I'll roll only 2, then I'll take another engage. That means I can recover another die that I'm gonna roll in after that, which is probably what I'm gonna do. Plus we have an enfeeble enemy which adds another light fatigue, so yeah, I definitely want to be mindful about my cooldown in this particular fight. So alright, my first engage, just rolling these 2 dice targeting Orc Bandit. Let's see how it goes. And wow, look at that, we dealt no damage. However, we still get 3 tenacity, which is honestly not that bad. Although I still need to take 1 true damage, but in this case I don't mind. So I'm taking true damage, dealing true damage to myself, and I'm resolving this dice like so, and I'm gaining 3 tenacity, which is definitely makes me feel now a little bit more capable of handling this fight. Right, as a second action, I'm gonna move 3 hexes closer to this gentleman. I think this is a nice spot for dealing Cleave area damage. I'm gonna make another engage, so I'm adding 2 light fatigue and switching battle form to heavy weapon. And I'm gonna roll Executioner and Cleave targeting Imperial Enforcer. Honestly, I don't think this Executioner can land a hit simply because it has 50% chance of misses. And of course I could have already used my innate ability because I have 3 tenacity, which means my Eldritch Insight is active, which means I can use my innate ability on dice of any level. But I think first I want, just to see if I get lucky by rolling this die, and then if I get not lucky, then I will use this probably with my innate ability, or maybe I'll use it for Cleave. We'll see how it goes. So anyway, I'm rolling these 2 dice targeting Imperial Enforcer. And wow, look at that, we've got lucky. We got not only Executioner, but we also got Cleave on the best side. Oh my goodness, now I feel bad. Maybe I should reroll, I don't know. So first of all, I'm gonna resolve Cleave, just because I wanted to be first in my cooldown track. So I'm dealing 7 damage, because that's how much current health I have. But we even don't need to remove any health chip from this gentleman, because we're simply gonna insta-defeat it with the Executioner. Other adjacent enemies, they take half of my damage rounded up, so this would be 7 damage, half by 2 and rounded up, that means 4 damage. So we're dealing 4 damage to this Dark Elf Bandit. And we're also dealing 4 damage to this Wood Elf Marauder, but not only it has 1 defense, it also has dodge, which means it prevents 1 damage for each dice that doesn't deal damage. And Executioner, even though I love this die, it doesn't deal any damage, so this means we're basically just doing 2 bits of damage to this Wood Elf Marauder. Then for the Executioner, I can choose whether to gain 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue. And you know what, I think I'm fine with taking 2 light fatigue. I was pretty careful with my cooldown so far, so I think this is the way I'm gonna resolve this die. And so, even though this enemy has Divert, this Executioner skill kind of completely bypasses that, so it still is defeated. However, because it has Rally, not only we need to replace it with a new random level 5 enemy, it also keeps going to the defeated pile, which is what we're gonna need for our Solar Reservoir ability, because this enemy just returned back to the enemy bag, which is very unfortunate, but hey. And the new enemy it replaces is a random level 5 enemy, in this case it's a Wisp Mother. Just look at that, another enemy with 3 combat dice, oh my. I'm gonna put this on the same hex, adjusting the health, so it has now 4 health. Alright, and my engage is resolved just like so. And I think now it's the time to trigger my innate ability, and because I have 3 tenacity, which means my Eldritch Insight is active, I can use it on dice of any level, and I can trigger this effect from the dice of anywhere in my adventure map, even in the cooldown track. So I'm thinking in this case I'm just gonna trigger this on Cleave, triggering this particular side to deal in this area damage again to all of those enemies. And because this innate ability treated as a free engage, I don't even need to gain light fatigue for that. So that means I'm dealing 7 damage to my target and 4 damage to all adjacent enemies, which in this case doesn't matter who is that, we're just gonna defeat them all. So we have Wood Elf Marauder defeated, we have Dark Elf Bandit defeated because it has a last health chip, and we have this Wisp Mother defeated as well. Even though it has Ethereal, that's still enough damage to go through. Now I'm gonna take another engage, so I'm gaining 2 light fatigue this time, and I'm switching my battle form to magic because I would like to try to blow up this health chip, hopefully dealing some damage to the some enemies around. And I'm also gonna roll Power Stone and Acrobatics. I could roll some other die, perhaps Destructive Touch or even Pulsar, but first of all I don't want to roll any other die because otherwise my cooldown track would be full, and remember that we have enfeeble enemies, so I need to be mindful about that. But also I just want to avoid using Pulsar, just might be as a little extra challenge for this fight. Okay, so let's see how it goes. I don't even need to declare a target for this particular roll, so just let's see what we get. Alright, and this is not that bad actually, because we have our Power Stone. That means I can change the result of 2 dice. In this case I'm definitely gonna do this for Windwalker, setting up to the value of 2. For the Elemental Rage though, I probably don't even need to change that because we have this big level 20 enemy, and frankly I would rather prefer to maybe use all of that damage to rather get rid of the level 1 enemy, because it's just minus another enemy that rolls 2 combat dice. I think this is best in this case. So I'm blowing up this chip using Elemental Rage, and because this enemy has only 5 health, I think this is already enough to defeat it, so yeah, I don't even need to adjust the roll this to 7. Then I'm resolving this dice in the following order, and that is the end of my turn. Now it's enemy's activation turn, starting with a level 20 enemy. They roll 3 combat dice against me, let's see what we get. And that is 4 damage, which I definitely don't want to take. So even though I have my Imperial Metal ability, I'm probably gonna save it, and for now I'm just gonna spend just a simple 1 tenacity, because I can trigger Soul Reservoir, preventing exactly 4 damage because we have 4 enemies in the defeated stack. So I'm not taking any of that damage. Next we have Orc Bandit, moving 1 hex adjacent to me, and they roll 2 combat dice, let's see what we get. We've got miss, but this is a pretty bad news for me because this enemy is aggressive and then gonna reroll it once. That is 2 damage, and this time I'm gonna use my Imperial Metal ability to prevent that much damage and also gain that much tenacity. So I'm now at 4 tenacity and I'm taking no damage. And finally the Argonian Bandit, they roll a simple 1 combat die for 1 damage, and this time, you know what, I don't mind taking this one. And I'm also gaining 1 light fatigue because this enemy has Enfeeble. Now it's the beginning of combat round 2, I'm recovering 5 dice, moving this 3 light fatigue to the supply, and recovering these 2 destructive stuff dice, moving all this like so. Right, so as my first action I think I'm just gonna move adjacent to this Frost Atronach, because I'm gonna need to deal some damage. Then I would like to use this Riven Blow ability, but because it requires a different battle form, that means I need to change it for the cost of 1 light fatigue, which I'm gonna do that, and switching now to Heavy Weapon. Now I'm gonna spend 1 tenacity to activate Riven Blows, and remember it costs only 1 because I have Windwalker, so I have this nice discount on the cost of my abilities. So for that I'm training my combat skill die, because remember it belongs to the Warrior Constellation. That means I'm dealing 2 true damage to this Frost Atronach, and I'm also gaining that much health myself. So I'm now back at full 8 health. Next I'm gonna trigger my innate ability on Frost Atronach, just guarantee defeating this using this Executioner skill die. So I'm draining this skill die, and this enemy is defeated just like so. Oh my goodness, this is so good. Yeah, I'm telling you, this is why Spellsword is so great. Alright, I think I could definitely finish off some of those enemies just by rolling basic Force Shock dice alongside some of those, but I probably don't want to do this just for the sake of fun. You know what, I think I'm gonna refresh my Strategic Reserve. I'm gonna use my Strategic Reserve ability to refresh my Racial ability. Because it requires Magic Battle Form, I'm gonna pay 1 light fatigue to change battle form again, so I'm switching to Magicka, and I'm spending just 2 tenacity to use the strategic reserve, and my racial ability is now active again, so I can prevent up to 3 damage and gain that much tenacity again. And you know what, let me just finish off my turn like that. Again, even though I could definitely use maybe some onslaught or roll on some of those dice, just not gonna do this for the sake of fun. Right, so it's now enemy's activation turn, starting with Orc Bandit. They move 1 hex closer to me, and they roll 2 combat dice. We've got miss, but again, because it's aggressive enemy, we need to reroll this. And well, that's another miss, so I'm fine just taking 1 damage. I can handle this. And next we have Argonian Bandit, just rolling 1 simple combat die. And look at that, 2 damage from a single enemy. Wow, as I said again, don't underappreciate level 1 enemies. So I'm definitely gonna use my racial ability this time. I'm glad I refreshed it, and I'm back to 3 tenacity, and I'm not taking any damage. Though of course I'm still gaining light fatigue because this enemy is enfeebled. Now it's the beginning of combat round 3. I'm recovering these 5 dice, and my Windwalker gonna still sit in the cooldown track, which is lovely. So I'm just recovering these magic dice, moving light fatigue to the supply, and switch moving this like so. And I think I have an idea what I want to do now, again just for the sake of fun. Let me hopefully get some crazy shenanigans, but first I need to get some good roll on these dice. So I'm rolling Power Stone and Daedric Curse. I don't even need to declare a target for this roll, so let's see what we get first. And we've got pretty much everything I needed, because I have Power Stone with number 1, which means I can now change the result of a 1 die. So I'm changing my Daedric Curse to this side, and it says I can deal 1 true damage to an adjacent enemy, and also can trigger any class ability that costs 2 or less tenacity. And now let's have a look at my Hero's Vigor. It says recover 1 drain skill die, and the tenacity cost of this ability is equal to the level of recovered die. So let's say if I want to recover my Cleave, normally the cost that would be 4 tenacity. But because the cost of this ability is X rather than just spending 1 and then any additional amount of tenacity like for some other abilities, that means now my Windwalker still applies here. So that means I can basically recover this Cleave die using Hero Vigor for only 2 tenacity, and what's even better that it's now essentially free because of this Daedric Curse. So this is how I'm resolving this dice. I'm dealing 1 true damage to, let's say, this Orc Bandit, and I'm also recovering Cleave because that costs only 2 tenacity. And now of course I'm gonna trigger my innate ability, so for that I'm treating this as a free engage, switching to heavy weapon battle form, and I'm just using my innate ability on the Cleave, dealing a bunch of damage to all of these enemies around. And yeah, that is totally the end of this fight. All enemies are defeated. And yeah, of course I'm going to recover all of those dice at the end of my battle, so this at the end of battle would normally go back just like so, which means next battle I would again already be able to roll these dice again, maybe even using my innate ability right away because I'm also sitting with 3 tenacity. So yeah, this class and this build is crazy good because of all of this innate and class abilities. And of course, as you can probably tell, I didn't even use Pulsar die because I know some people say that blindness is overpowered, but yeah, hey, you can totally handle the fight even without rolling this die at all. It's a little bit of shame that I haven't had a chance to showcase the destructive touch. I think it's lovely because it affects any enemy in play, which means you can defeat an enemy without even targeting them, without even being inside, just any level 1 or 5 instantly defeated. But hey, I think I did a pretty nice job with other class abilities anyway. And that's a wrap for today's video. These class guides take quite a bit of time and effort to put together, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for more board gaming content. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can also do this over on Patreon, and it really means a lot to me. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.